do is what I wanted to talk with you all today about is some of the latest finds that we've made regarding Francis Taylor Madison, especially with our being able to locate the early planter cottage in the South Yard that a lot of you all know about. What we've always called the South Kitchen, which was the South Kitchen in the early 19th century, turns out to be the early planter's cottage dating to the 1750s. And I'll get into details and photos of that in a few. For those of you all that have met Jen Glass, she's actually moving on. She's going to become the restoration historic architect down at Colonial Williamsburg. And so she's leaving at the end of this month. So we're gonna miss her, but if you look at the webcam for the South Yard, the South kitchen, the planter's cottage is just going up right now. So it's really good. She's really excited about the new job, and we're excited about having a wonderful contact down there at Colonial Williamsburg. But let me see. Yeah, it looks like we get most people are here that said they were going to be coming on, so we could go ahead and get started. What I'll do is I'm going to share my screen, and we're gonna I'm gonna be recording this. So if anybody misses part of it or they have to sign out, we'll send you all the link. If you're interested in receiving the link, and we don't have your email from before, just put your email in the chat, and we'll be able to capture that. Sometimes we've been able to locate who most people are, but there's a couple. I think there's Sarah Lee and I were trying to figure out who Spike was. But if you want to receive some of the updates, just go ahead and put your name in the chat, your email in the chat. But let's see. Can everybody see the screen? Let me go to keep you all up on the screen here. Oh no, there it is. Okay, now you should be able to see my shared screen at this point. Okay, you see the map of Montpelier and my arrow moving up by the main house. Okay, good deal. Well, you all, everyone knows about Montpelier and who we are, being the home of James and Dolly Madison, what we're up to with the restoration of the house, interpreting the enslaved community. But what a lot of people don't realize is just the depth of time that the Madisons and the enslaved community have at Montpelier. It goes back to the 1720s, and recently in working with the descendant communities and looking at some of the history, it's really amazing how these plantations are so connected to the river systems on which they're based. So we are in the Rapidan drainage, which flows into the Rappahannock, which eventually goes out to the Chesapeake Bay. And the Rappahannock is associated with the port town of Fredericksburg. So but when you go down to Monticello, it's the Ravenna, which goes to the James and then ends up in Richmond. And in so many cases, all the family connections follow from these rivers, and Montpelier is no exception. And we'll get into this with the Taylor, but also the Madison family. They began, before they settled, moved to the Orange County, to the western part of the Piedmont. They were in the Tidewater around Fredericksburg. So there are these connections that continue, because in the 18th and 19th century, all the goods from Montpelier, were sent down to Fredericksburg for export to England, and all the goods coming in came through Fredericksburg. So all these market relations follow the family relations, and these continue all the way into the 19th century. It's pretty amazing. And all the families that are connected, the Barbers, the Conways, the Willises, the Madisons, the Taylors, all these have connections from the same place, which was around the area of Fredericksburg. So, when you look at the origins of Montpelier, it becomes really important to understand, even for what's going on in the retirement years, what happened earlier on, because there are these connections that, only make sense when you understand some of the origins. And so for getting to the origins, for Montpelier, by the time the main house, the core of the brick mansion was built and completed in 1765, there was over 40 years of history at Montpelier, and a lot of this, stems from the 1723 patent that's listed as the Madison shoe patent in the books. But all this came from the Taylor family, and the origins of this are at where most of you all know is at Mount Pleasant. This is over by the Madison family cemetery. And in terms of looking at the origins of a lot of these families, Montpelier is no exception to this rule of moving from the east to the west. In fact, where the Madisons and the Taylors originally came from is what today is Caroline County. Back in the day was King and Queen County, and this is just outside of Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg is right here on the fall line. On the fall line is this area that marks where the rivers are no longer navigable by large ocean-going vessels. So basically, Richmond and Fredericksburg are these port towns that all the crops would be brought down to be sent to England. And then for those either merchants, or in the case of James Madison's father, his parents were merchant factors that would send slaves down to Fredericksburg to pick up items to bring to the plantation or to the region to sell. So in terms of the origins of the Madisons and the Taylors, the Madisons, when they were first married, this is Frances Taylor Madison and her husband Ambrose Madison. The first 9 years of their marriage was spent in King and Queen County, and it was only and during this time when they were married, that's when they obtained the land patent from Frances Taylor's family, the Taylor family from Montpelier. And when they were first married, what they arranged for was to have a gang of slaves and an overseer sent out to Orange County to clear the land and began to establish a settlement, which became Mount Pleasant. We'll get into some of the photos and the details of that in a second. But it wasn't until 1732, when a lot of this area was cleared, that the Madisons moved from King and Queen County out to what is today Montpelier. And in that year, there was a lot that happened. In 1732, when they arrived, less than probably a month after they arrived, Ambrose Madison is poisoned by two of his slaves and a neighboring slave. And within about 4 months, he's dead. And within that time, he writes out a will. And in that will, he specifies that his son, James Madison Sr., who would become senior, when he comes of age in 1741, he would be the one who inherited. That's when he would inherit the plantation of Mount Pleasant. And so this set in a course of action that really resulted in some really intriguing interaction between Frances Madison, James Madison's grandmother, and James Madison's father, James Madison Sr. And it's really almost this, this choreographed or orchestrated power dance between mother and son. And in a nutshell, basically, Frances Madison ends up running the plantation, and this is what we originally thought happened until we started to do some detailed analysis. Originally, we thought that Frances Madison, after her husband's death, ran the plantation from 1732 into the 1840s, early 1840s, when her son took over the plantation. But and then 1740s, when her son comes of age, the assumption was just because of primogeniture and being in a patriarchal society that her son took over. But when you start to look at some of the plantation records, which really was our desire to look into some of these plantation records was inspired by the what we found at Mount Pleasant, which was a relatively small house that was occupied for over 30 years by a very prominent family. And it made us think, why is this happening? Why is it that the main house isn't completed until 1765, which becomes, the family seat for the Madison family? And so it made us start to look into, especially Frances Madison's life. When you look at, Frances Madison's life at the same time as her son's life, and especially when, at the time when he marries Nellie Conway Madison, you start to see some patterns. So looking at this in detail, for Frances Taylor Madison, like I mentioned, it's in 1723 that she marries Ambrose Madison. And at that time, that's when her father gives his two daughters land patents for what would become Orange County. So in 1723, both her and her sister, who's a Chew, are married, and for their wedding presents, they receive these patents of land in what becomes Montpelier. Then in 1732, that's when Frances is widowed. And what's interesting is she never remarries. And I mean, where she's living at that time, Mount Pleasant, she would have been surrounded by people that she would have known. All the families that are in this area are coming up from Fredericksburg, from Caroline, King and Queen County. So she would have been within a network of people that would have known what was going on with her. And I have no doubt that if we had the records, that there would have been numerous proposals that were either made to Frances or highly suggested to her for remarriage, because she would have been, if you think about what it would have happened if she remarried, what would have happened to her land and slaves if she remarried? She would have, see a couple of responses. She would have lost that to her husband. Basically, her husband, by English law, by coverture, would be able to claim that as his property. So her never remarrying, we're thinking, is quite intentional, especially when you start to look at some of the things she starts doing soon after her husband's death. 1737, what she does is she gets together with her brother-in-law, Thomas Chew, and she renegotiates his land patent to obtain a section of that. And then in that deed in which she, is able to get legal ownership from the crown to the Madison family name, what she specifies is that she's to maintain control over the plantation up until her death, which in effect changes the conditions of her husband's will, so that she's running the plantation through all this time. And during this time, all through the 1750s, she's marketing tobacco under her own name. She is, the one that is really engaged with the market activities as well, more than likely, in terms of negotiating prices and having the tobacco shipped to market in Fredericksburg. And during this time, she has her son, James Madison Sr., literally keep separate books. So we're beginning to see a pattern where there's two plantations at Montpelier. Her son comes of age. When he comes of age, he starts doing his own activities. And even in items that he's purchasing in Fredericksburg that he is purchasing for her, there's a transfer in the ledgers between the two plantations. So you get two different plantations or two different books. And what's really quite remarkable is that despite the wealth that's generated by the Madison family between Frances Taylor Madison and James Madison Sr. Into the 1750s, is that Frances Madison maintains Mount Pleasant as the family seat up until her death in 1761. And it's not until her death, and we'll get into this in a few minutes, it's not until her death that the main house that we know of today, called Montpelier, begins to be constructed. And there's this surprise that we found at the planter's cottage, which really hammers this home in terms of some of this process. So when she dies in 1761, this is when the entire plantation, lock, stock, and barrel, transfers to James Madison Sr. And in looking at some of James Madison Sr.'s activities during this time period, it's during his mother's lifetime that he starts to diversify the plantation. This is when he has his slaves start to get into blacksmithing. He becomes a merchant factor, meaning he's importing goods from England and then selling them from a shop at Montpelier to other farmers and other residents in Orange County. And he starts to job out slaves as artisans, as carpenters. And what this does is, by the time you get to the American Revolution, with James Madison Sr., the son, diversifying Montpelier to serve the local infrastructure, the local economy, Montpelier is no longer solely dependent on the ebbs and flows of the tobacco economy. And when the bottom falls out of the tobacco economy during the American Revolution, and a lot of other estates go into debts, Montpelier doesn't have that problem. And so what this really allows is for James Madison Jr., the future president, when he's starting to serve time in the Virginia Assembly and councils on the committees on safety, and then eventually work with the on the Virginia plan and work towards ratification of the Constitution, he doesn't have to worry about what's happening back at the plantation, because the parents are operating a thriving plantation that literally is not in debt, but has cash on hand. And so this has a huge impact on what we're about Montpelier, being the home of James Madison, father of the Constitution. There's some doubt that we would have Madison be the father of the Constitution if it wasn't what was going on behind the scenes between Francis Taylor Madison and James Madison Sr. and Nellie Conway Madison. So all through this time, James Madison Sr. is constantly looking for ways to build his economic base. He's when he marries Nellie Conway in 1749, he comes into her land and slaves and immediately begins to move her slaves around to create economic benefit for their household. And doubtlessly she's involved in this as well. But there's probably it wouldn't be a surprise if this marriage was one where there was some economic consideration being taken into consideration. And this is when the new residence for the main house is sought, and this early planter's cottage is built. I'll get into that into a second. And some of the evidence for James Madison Sr. looking for ways to take advantage of some of these peculiarities of male inheritance of land and slaves is he manages the inheritance for some of his nieces, his sister's daughter, and he's managing her slaves until she becomes of age for about 6 years. And so he's getting profits from that as well, while he waits for sounds terrible, while he's waiting for his mother to pass away. And so he's managing the whole plantation. He's obviously not waiting for that, but the process of that. So during this time, Senior becomes, basically holds prominent roles in the county of Orange. He's a sheriff, he's a colonel of the local militia, he's a member of the vestry, he's a justice. He's basically asserting his role as a prominent planner to serve in these public roles that again would give him decision-making power in the county, which in the end would benefit him because he's able to structure what's happening in Orange County to make sure that roads are being built. While his mother, Frances Madison, had to petition the county to build roads, he's sitting in the seat of power where he can order those roads to be built. So it's all these items that the differences between what his mother's able to do and what he's able to do because of his gender. And finally, once his mother passes away, this is when he arranges for the construction of the manor house that we know as Montpelier, and that's when the family seat changes up to the main house. And we'll talk about that next in terms of the some of the physical evidence. And this is where we want to jump over to Mount Pleasant and look and see what's happening there. And so at Mount Pleasant, as it's arranged to be built by James Madison, the president's grandparents, probably by the time Ambrose and Frances arrive in 1732 with their 3 children, the main house and the kitchen and all this complex is already built. And soon after, what gets added is a cemetery because Ambrose Madison passes away. So he's more than likely the first resident in the Madison family cemetery. And this picture on the right here is a painting that we had commissioned back in 2005 by a local artist to render what we think Mount Pleasant would have looked like based on the archaeology. And so Linda Boudreau Montgomery, took line drawings that we had made in AutoCAD of the buildings and then rendered this space for what Mount Pleasant would look like. What's on the left is the kind of typical unfriendly archaeology map, the plan view. So here's the cemetery right here. The path today actually comes up along through here in a straight line. This is the route the path used to take when we were doing excavations at the main house back in 2002. We changed all this path makeup around 2005. So for what we've got at Mount Pleasant, the area that when I started at Montpelier that had been excavated, what turns out to be the service complex for the main house, and that's all the area, including the kitchen and this slave quarter, and then the area that I started working on late in 2000 was locating the main house, and we'll go over some of the evidence for what Mount Pleasant looked like. What's really fascinating about this area right here, here's a blow-up of it, is this pit right here. This feature right here is a subfloor pit that turns out to be dates to the 1720s. It's one of, not only one of the earliest features at Montpelier, it's one of the earliest evidence for structures in the Virginia Piedmont. I don't know of another site out there that has this early of a feature. And this is a subfloor pit below a structure, probably a log structure, or a structure set on piers that is burned in 1732 when the kitchen and the main house is built. And at that time, what they do is there's a borrow pit that was dug to obtain clay for making bricks, and all the burnt remains of this building are scraped away and then put into this pit and then buried. So we've got this incredible archaeological record of not only the subfloor pit that's underneath this building, but also the burned remains of this building, which includes melted window glass, a lot of architectural material that suggests it could have been a frame building. Then what was built on top of that, which was really confusing when we were trying to sort all this out, is there was a post and ground building built after 1732, because in the post holes, we found the same melted window glass that we found in the subfloor pit and then the borrow pit that dates to before, right around the time of 1732. So what I'm going to go over next is probably going to be confusing as all get out, because believe me, when we were trying to analyze all these features, it was horribly confusing. We ended up doing, and Leslie, you'll enjoy this, we did a vessel analysis where we basically looked at all the different vessels that were in each of these features, did crossmens, and then were able to associate their filling and abandonment with certain time periods. And if you're interested in this, I can send you a copy of a report we have on this. Actually, for those of y'all, Pat, you might remember Kevin Fogel. He wrote his master's thesis eons ago, back in 2006, on this when he was at South Carolina. But for the one structure here that contained just the lion's share of artifacts is the kitchen. It's this building right here. So you've got the kitchen here, the main house. What I've got highlighted in color right here is this post and ground structure that we found the archaeological evidence of. Remember, this is what Mount Pleasant would have looked like from around 1732 up until about 1761 when Francis Taylor Madison passed away. Now for the kitchen, this structure right here, we've got evidence from this beautiful cellar hole that's stone lined. And here's a shot of this stone lined cellar. You've got a foundation here that runs up here to an entrance. And then you've got a sump in the middle of this where we found over a dozen wine bottles. So this we think was a wine cooler, and they had all these seals of James Madison Sr. on them. And then we think that this stone wall used to run over here, and it was replaced by a post and ground trench when this wall collapsed in during the later period of occupation. And in the fill for this structure, what we found were all kinds of burnt ceramics and all burnt household remains. And it gave evidence that the kitchen burns when it was being occupied, but it burns in the 1790s. So after, this is some 25 years after Francis Madison has passed away. And these ceramics, the latest dating of these ceramics are these blue chinoiserie pearlwares that are a tea set. And what's fascinating about this tea set is that we found several broken examples of these. It was a saucer and a teacup, because you've got a complete set of saucers and teacups right here in the cellar for the main house, which was used basically as a trash deposit by the overseer who was living in the kitchen. So if your head is starting to spin with all these changes in occupation, bear with me. What the most important part of this is, the main house in terms of looking for that. So by the fall of 2000, we knew we didn't have the main house because we had the kitchen and this earlier outbuilding. And we started doing survey all around this area because in 2001, if you all might remember, that was the 250th birthday of James Madison. So we wanted to have a big gala affair where we could say, we found his childhood home. And boy, the irony of that, because while we did find the early Mount Pleasant main house, I would have probably just given up in 2001 if I realized that wasn't the main house. We had another 15 years to wait before we found Madison's childhood home up at the main house, and I'll get into that in a second. But for the fall of 2000, what we did is resistivity surveys, ground penetrating radar surveys. This is a shot of me in December of 2000, and then a metal detector survey in which we were able to locate where the main house was. And then we spent the next 2 years, that's the star right there, we spent the next 2 years excavating this site. We removed the plow zone to reveal this beautiful stone-lined cellar. And then in the summer of 2002, we excavated units in that cellar, and we found, much to our dismay, in the initial testing, we were finding all kinds of burn nails. All the burn material we found in the cellar hole was in these top ash deposits. You can actually see the profile really nicely right here. All this grayer material is all ash deposits thrown in there in the 1780s when the overseer was occupying the kitchen. So all his trash deposit, all the household trash deposits were thrown into the main house. What we found in the lower deposits of the main house is all this architectural remains, including clay nogging that was used to infill between the studs, and then lots and lots of wall plaster, like the fragment right here, and lots of burned nails. And all this material, there's not a single artifact that postdates the early 1760s. So what it gave us evidence for is that the Madisons, after Frances dies, and she dies of yellow fever, by the way, so maybe this is related to it, they stripped the house of any usable materials. Like, we didn't find any door hardware, we found no window glass, we found very little in the way of even trim nails. So they're stripping all the woodwork out of the building, even a single whole brick. All the bricks are taken out. We only find fragments of bricks. And then they burn the remains, the framing and the lath plaster, and all this stuff collapses into the cellar hole. And what we end up with is this incredible stratigraphy. This is a profile of the main house right here with the house on top of it. Everything that's in red, green, blue, and dark gray is all the architectural remains from the burning of the main house. And what's in green here is all these trash deposits post 1765 that are from the kitchen occupants, we're presuming is the overseer's house. And they're using this as a trash pit. And then this blue outline is what we're thinking is the outline for the main house. We need to, when we first figured the layout of the main house, worked with Mark Wenger from Colonial Williamsburg on this, we had just started the mansion restoration. And so we basically had to button up Mount Pleasant and head up to the main house. And that was in 2004, and we haven't been back since. Well, we're back there now with the overseer's house, but we haven't been back to Mount Pleasant since 2003 with the work we've been doing on the main house since that time in the South Yard. Some of the few items we found from the Madison period include this beautiful andiron, which we found an exact match to in the South kitchen, which just blew us away, because then we realized the South kitchen was this earlier planter's cottage. And then the other thing we found were these early wine bottle seals. And what I'm fascinated with is this seal IM, that's for James Madison, with I, the J being spelled out as an I. And you have a similar thing with IM's Madison being James Madison. This is the senior's, James Madison Sr.'s household wine bottle seal. Well, we find this IM's Madison written out up at the main house. and we find the same seals up there. The only place where we find these IMs is down at Mount Pleasant, and I'm wondering if this is, the earlier version of his wine bottle seal that is before he and Nellie are married and they create a household and move up to the planter's cottage in 1750. So many times when we found these in the field, this IM, I had the fantasy, just in the 95-degree heat, that I was looking at FM, which would just be mind-blowing. And there's, for Francis Madison, but no such luck. We have not found an FM yet, but there's still time out there. But for the main house, this gives us something that what we found in the excavations give us an idea of just, how, what kind of shape the main house was when Francis Madison died. One of the major clues is in the cellar wall. There used to be a wooden crib wall across the back here. And of course, this was stone through here. But we have evidence that this entire part of this wall collapsed in during sometime in the 1750s. And this crib wall falls into the cellar hole and means that part of the cellar hole is no longer usable, and there's water infiltration here. And so we're thinking, by the time you get to the period of 1761, a lot of these buildings are in pretty bad shape. And the Madisons decide, just to not even, it might have been that the main house wasn't even usable by the overseer. And that's why they decide to have the overseer live in this kitchen. So all during this time, from 1732 up until 1761, this is Francis Madison, the Montpelier family seat. And where the house is located during this whole time period for this 30-year history is it's located in not a very prominent location. It's on a slope. It's a relatively small structure with no evidence for any kind of additions being put on it. So they're living, Francis is living in what essentially is a planter's cottage or a starter cottage for the first 30 years of the plantation's existence. And some of the rationale for that might be that, having a prominent house might not have given her, she might have not have had the same utility for that as if she was a male in this patriarchal society where she would be, a member of the vestry, everything that her son was. At Mount Pleasant, she was able to pursue her economic activities, but not political activities. So maybe that's an explanation for the smaller size of the house and why there aren't substantial changes made to Mount Pleasant. Where you really see, these changes being made is when Nellie Conway Madison and James Madison Sr. are married. And at that, for their household, we've got this massive brick mansion that's associated with their household. But early on, it wasn't this large house that was there. What we have evidence for is by 1750, there's this little 16 by 20 building up by the main house that's built. And we finally, we found evidence for this in 2016 when we were doing the excavation. So for years, we thought this 16 by 20 structure that we've known about since the early 90s was the kitchen. And it wasn't until we found the top of the chimney that was buried underneath all this brick rubble from the chimney fall that we realized that this was a different kind of structure. And this chimney top, what happens is the chimney, sometime after 1829, after Nellie Conway Madison passes away, mother of the president, this chimney falls over and the top of it gets buried when it falls. There's so much weight. And then it's also covered over by all the brick rubble from the chimney fall. When we uncovered this, we found so inside the throat of the chimney. And when we showed it to the masons, what they saw, to some of the architectural historians, especially Jane Glass, when she saw this plaster collar that matched the plaster collar for the main house, she was of the opinion that this was not a chimney that you'd have associated with an outbuilding like a kitchen, that this was more akin to something that would be more similar to the chimney for a planter's cottage, given its size. And when she brought in other architectural historians, they were able to assemble, some contemporary examples of these planter cottages that were out there. And what Jen has drawn up is, plans for this planter cottage that we're actually reconstructing right now. This is a shot just from yesterday with the chimney fully constructed for the planter's cottage, the south kitchen. And here are Jen's plans for this building. And what's unusual about this planter cottage is that when James Madison Sr. and Nellie Conway Madison are married, we're thinking that's when they moved to Montpelier. They first move into this space, not Mount Pleasant. And there's a couple of clues for that. One is that James Madison Sr. in some of his books, he's ordering a plantation bell in 1749. He's ordering paneled doorways that would not, he wouldn't need to order a plantation bell for Mount Pleasant because Francis would have already had a plantation bell. He's ordering it for this structure. And then another clue for this is that, it's hard to speculate on this, but we can, is that James Madison was not born here at Montpelier. He was born down at Port Conway. And so there's the potential that Francis waits to move up to Montpelier only when this cottage is complete. And, who knows, maybe it's Francis's decision that she doesn't want the family in her house. Maybe it's Nellie saying, no way am I moving in with your mother. I want to have us have our own house before we move up there. That's some 21st century speculation on in-laws history. But nevertheless, what we've got evidence for is that from the period between 1751 and 1762, this is during James Madison's early childhood. And those of you that know James Madison know this is a painting that was done when he was 32 in 1783. So, he looks like he's about 12 years old, but he was 30 years old. So, but I'm using this for, kind of emblematic of him during his first 10 years. For James Madison Jr., when he was, growing up these first 10 years, he would have been spending, in terms of his parents' household, he would have associated this as, his parents' house and Mount Pleasant as his grandmother's house. And when you look at this in terms of the functioning of the plantation, there's literally, not just these two households, there's two plantations at Montpelier during Madison's first 10 years, during not his formative years, but during his years where he's becoming socialized on how to interact as a Madison family member and, becoming socialized how to act in society. And there's accounts where Madison, learned to read from his grandmother. So he's visiting his grandmother. I mean, for all we know, he could have been, spent many nights down at Mount Pleasant with his grandmother. And during this time, he's coming to understand how, while his parents are running, one plantation economy, his grandmother's running the other part of the plantation economy. And you've got essentially, two different, groups who could be seen as factions that were opposed, but they're not. They're running their own separate households, their own separate economies, but they're working together under the umbrella of a single plantation. And if this sounds familiar to you, it probably is, because when you think about, when Madison is in the Virginia Assembly in the 1770s, 1780s, and when he starts to write the Constitution, he's dealing with this, this messed up situation where you get these different factions that are all organized under the Articles of Confederation. And there's these groups that are heading in different directions that need to be under this broader umbrella. And so that becomes what he writes and the other founders create as the Constitution, which is designed to take different factions and have them work together to create a stronger whole so that one faction doesn't dominate over the other. And literally, he's raised his early first 10 years of his life is spent in this environment. So, you think about the kind of influences this would have had on Madison. This was his socialization here at Montpelier. And it was, one that really can't be ignored, and really is why we do what we do at Montpelier. I mean, a lot of what we do at Montpelier is trying to understand, contextualize Madison and his formulating the Constitution, and not just look at Madison. Part of what we do is look at him as the incredible scholar and intellectual he was, but the other part is looking at who he was as a human being. what his early childhood life was like, who he was as a Virginia planter, who's raised, with plantation slavery being the norm for society, for, understanding Black people as being chattel slaves and having that be part of his psyche. So with this, not only do you have these two plantations that are being run by these two different generations of the Madisons, you would have had an enslaved community who would have been existing under these two different plantations that would have obviously had family relations between each other, multiple generations, but would have been working this out with the heads of households as well. So, it's doubly complex when you take into account that the generations of the enslaved community that was here as well and working under these two plantation systems. Because literally, Frances Madison, when she's buying something when she's getting something from her son, it's a transaction in a book. So you think about the transactions that were happening in labor as well. All sorts of interesting things, it is behind, just lurking, below the surface of some of this history. And it's really, when for Madison's permanence here at Montpelier, it's not until he actually goes to school let's see, that would have been in he goes to school in 1762 down to the Robertson's Academy down in Fredericksburg. That's after his grandmother dies. When he comes home from that, he starts visiting. The main house is starting to be built, but the slaves haven't finished building the main house at Montpelier until 1765, and that's when he's home for about 2 years before he heads to the College of New Jersey for his secondary education. So, his early childhood would have been really associated with these two households. So, really, some fascinating implications for James Madison, for his conceptualization of where these ideas for the Constitution came from, and it's something that really it begins to help us look at what Madison's contributions were in a different way, not as Madison as this individual scholar, but Madison as part of this family, as part of this community, who he's being raised with and by and for. And it, really, it makes what we're finding, with the material record even more important in terms of, fleshing some of this stuff out. So, but that's that's kind of the latest finds that we're looking at. And again, we're just beginning to look at some of the history of this, since we literally just figured out the planter's cottage. About we figured out the planter's cottage, found the planter's cottage, and realized it was what it was in late 2016. But it wasn't until 2018 that we started to bring all these strings of evidence together and realize what a really good case we had for the Madison, the second generation of Madisons, their history being associated with the planter's cottage that we're reconstructing right now. So it makes the completion of this planter's cottage even more exciting. And of course, planter's cottage has even more history, because starting in the 18 teens, it becomes the kitchen, and we've got all the oral history that we have associated with Betty Kearse and her family and its association with the kitchen. So just a lot of exciting things on the horizon that are coming up with all this. So, but I'd love to open this up for questions or comments, and excited to hear some response from you all, because you all have seen a lot of this history unfold with our discoveries through the year. And for many of you, literally were at the kitchen digging and helping make those discoveries. And I'm hoping that before I retire, we're able to go back to Mount Pleasant and begin to answer some of the questions that are there. What's neat about the overseer's house is we're beginning to find some, and I'll stop sharing screens right now. We're starting to find some of the early ceramics at the overseer's house that are probably from activity areas that would have just stretched over from Mount Pleasant. So while we're separate from Mount Pleasant at the overseer's house, there's still a little bit of overlap there. But me see if we've got some questions. Yeah, Carol said, I'd love to have a recording. Yeah, we'll go ahead and send this out. It usually takes me about 4 hours to finish baking the recording because Zoom has to do whatever it does to it, and then I've got to upload it to YouTube, which takes another hour. So we'll get it out to you by this evening. Oh yeah, Cindy, you're asking, great to see these sites brought together. Would there be 2 overseers? Yeah, what we've got for that, Cindy, what I forgot to mention is that with the evidence we have for the kitchen burning in 1795, the reason why we know that date is because there's a letter that Madison receives when he's in Philadelphia from the overseer saying, hey, bad news, the overseer's house burned, all the wool from the whole entire season went up with a fire. And when we found that letter, we had excavated Mount Pleasant in the kitchen and found all the remains of this burnt household in the kitchen. And so we realized that was the association. And after that, it seems, is when the overseer's house that we're working on right now was built, which was built separately from the Mount Pleasant complex. And thank goodness for that, because it means that right now we've got an assemblage for an overseer that goes from the 1770s into the 1790s over at Mount Pleasant with a kitchen assemblage. And then we've got a whole different assemblage that we can compare with the later dating overseer's house starting in probably like the 1800s. So makes for some exciting comparisons. And Victoria, you ask, is the term planter's cottage contemporaneous, or is it just the name that you've given the structure? I'm not sure what the term planter connotes or connoted. Yeah, planter, what that refers to is owner of a plantation that is planting tobacco. So if you're planting tobacco, you're called a planter. And this is from the contemporary time period. If you start to have your workforce, your enslaved workforce, engaged in plowing, plowing agriculture, you're called a farmer. So Madison Sr. and his son Madison Jr. are called farmers, not because they're out there manning the plow, but because they're managing these operations. And so the planter's cottage, I'll need to ask Jen where the planter's cottage comes from, whether that's contemporaneous. I know it's around in the 19th century, but whether that term was used in the 18th century, what it usually refers to is kind of a starter home. And it's one that is used for Pear Valley and a couple of other examples that are out there out in Virginia and other places in Maryland. Let me see what other questions we've got. Oh, Dale asks, what kind of ceramics are you finding? Was it near the overseer's house? Yeah, the ceramics we're finding out at the overseer's house, the 1820s overseer's house we're at right now, those are the typical, the majority of them are transfer wares, pearl wares that are hand painted, slip glazed earthenwares, the slip decorated wares, but we're also finding 18th century ceramics such as what are called Staffordshire or slip decorated earthenwares, German stonewares, Westerwald, or the the gray-bodied stonewares that have an incised lines and very fine painting and decoration, and that's opposed to the American stonewares where they just slap the blue paint on there. So two different types of ceramics there. Oh, thank you, Tracy. Yeah, I do want to write a book one day. I need to take like a year off and do that. So I've been applying for a couple of grants. I'm hoping I could do that. Let's see what else. Okay, yeah, I think I get all the questions here. So, but yeah, if anybody else have any questions or comments, what I'll do is, Sarah Lee, I'll send you an email with the link to the YouTube video, because I can get that early on, because once I load it, YouTube provides the link. But I'll also put a link to the report on Mount Pleasant, that we wrote back in 2006 that Kevin and I wrote, and then also put in a link to the archaeology booklet because that has some good summaries of a lot of this stuff. So, let's see. Well, I think it looks like that's all the questions we've got. It's great to see everybody. We're Sarah Lee and I and Mary and Terry and I have made up the schedule for 2021. So Sarah Lee is prepping a MailChimp announcement for that hopefully will go out on Saturday. And we're going to have the discount for alumni and for the early bird discount for the fall of 2021. And so that'll be in that email announcement. And if anyone is interested in being part of our mailing list, this is one that we do quarterly newsletters. Put your email into the chat here, and Sarah Lee will make sure that you're on the list, or just send Sarah Lee a note. Sarah Lee lives at dig@montpelier.org. In fact, she's in the library right now in her office. But great seeing everybody. I'm gonna copy all the comments here, Sarah Lee, so if there's any emails in here, I'll send them to you. And great seeing everybody, and take care of yourselves. And next, for the lunch and learns, we're gonna start doing the lunch and learns every 2 weeks, because that's gonna, it's a little bit to put these together every week. And what we'll do is, if anybody has any additional suggestions for lunch and learns, please let us know. We're going to do the November newsletter in 2 weeks, and at that time we'll have the next schedule of lunch and learns for November. But if anybody has any suggestions for what they'd like to hear, I can't remember if it was you, Wendy, or who it was, suggested that they'd like to hear about some of my work I've done in Jamaica compared to Montpelier. And actually, I've got a paper that I wrote years ago, about 6 years ago, that talks about that. And I could give a kind of an expanded version of that for the next lunch and learn if you're interested, or if there's something more pressing. I think Terry had talked maybe about doing a lunch and learn at the site, but I got to talk to him. So, but we'll figure out the schedule. And good seeing everybody. We'll see you all. Let me make sure there's no other questions. Yeah, good seeing you, Carolyn. So bye, everybody. Take care. And Sarah Lee, I'm copying these right now to send to you.
Oh, so.
Good. Thank you, Sarah Lee.
Cool beans.
Did you get everybody's email?
I got most everyone. So everybody that messaged me about it. And
Very
then,
cool.
Yep, we should be
Sounds good. Awesome. All right, we'll see you on the flip side. Bye, Sarah Lee. Bye, everybody.